Welcome to Reading the Bible Together and Genesis chapter 23. Now, after chapter 22 and the climactic story of Abraham and the binding of Isaac, as that episode is formally known, the next three chapters serve to kind of wind the story of Abraham up. We've got the death of Sarah, the finding of a wife for Isaac, and the death of Abraham himself. Now, it's more than that, though. It's the first concrete sign of the fulfillment of the promises of God long made to Abraham. And Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, may his memory be a blessing, puts it so very well as these three chapters serve as a unit. He writes, this section of scripture focuses on two episodes, both narrated at length and in intricate detail. The first deals with Abraham's purchase of a field with a cave as a burial place for Sarah. The second with a mission to find a wife for his son Isaac. The juxtaposition of these two events goes beyond mere happenstance. The Torah is the Hebrew word for the Bible, does not narrate them at length simply because they happened. Torah means teaching. It tells us what happened only when events that occurred then have a bearing on what we need to know now. And the focus on these two issues thus requires closer attention. Abraham, the first bearer of the covenant, receives two promises, both of which are stated 5 times. The first is of a land. Time and again he is told by God that the land to which he has traveled, Canaan, will one day be his. In fact, 5 times he is made this promise in chapter 12, 13, 15, again later in 15, and then in 17. The second great promise God makes to Abraham was the promise of children, also stated, not coincidentally, 5 times. Beginning with, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great. You'll be a blessing in chapter 12. And then I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth and so on in chapter 13. And then again in chapter 15, like the stars in the sky. Then in chapter 17, you'll be the father of many nations. Then in chapter 22, your descendants will be like the sand on the seashore. Now, those are remarkable promises. The land in its length and breadth will be Abraham and his children's as an everlasting possession. Secondly, that Abraham will have as many children as the dust of the earth, the stars of the sky, the sand on the seashore. He will be the father, not of one nation, but of many nations. But what, though, is the reality at the time Sarah dies here in chapter 23? The reality is Abraham owns no land and has only one son. He had another Ishmael, but he was told that Ishmael would not be the bearer of the covenant. And so within this context, the landless Abraham of only one child, the significance of the two central episodes of this section of Scripture, chapters 23, 24, and 25, becomes clear. First, Abraham undergoes a lengthy bargaining process with the Hittites, the residents of that area of Canaan, to buy a field with a cave in which to bury Sarah. It's a tense and even humiliating encounter. The Hittites say one thing, but they mean another. As a group, they say, "Sir, listen to us. You are a prince of God in our midst. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs." And Ephron, the owner of the field Abraham wants to buy, says, "Listen to me. I give you the field. I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." But as the narrative makes clear, this elaborate generosity is a facade for some extremely hard bargaining. Abraham knows and says that he's an alien and a sojourner amongst you, meaning, among other things, that he has no right to own land. That's the force of their reply, which, when you strip it of its overlay of courtesy, really means, use one of our burial sites. You may not acquire one of your own. Now, Abraham is not deterred. He insists that he wants to buy his own. And Ephron's reply, "It is yours, I give it to you," is in fact the prelude to a demand for a highly inflated price, 400 silver shekels, which for a cave in a field is wildly exorbitant. Finally, however, Abraham fulfills his wish. The transfer of ownership is recorded in precise legal prose to signal that at last Abraham owns part of the land. It's a small part, one field and a cave, a burial place bought at great expense. And that field, that cave is as much of the divine promise of the land as Abraham will see in his lifetime. Now, the next section tells of Abraham's concern that Isaac should have a wife. Isaac's got to be by this time at least 37 years old, which was his age at Sarah's death. He's still unmarried. Abraham has a child, but no grandchild, no posterity. As with the purchase of the cave, so here, chapter 24, acquiring a daughter-in-law will take a lot of money and hard negotiation. Well, thank you, Rabbi Sachs. We're going to come back to the acquisition of the daughter-in-law story tomorrow. But the thing I want to focus on is that this field, this burial cave, that's the only part of the promised land which upon his death Abraham can truly call his own. It is the smallest of beginnings. Secondly, of the promised great nation, Abraham has seen only one designated heir, which is Isaac. And we're not told whether or not Abraham lived to see the birth of Isaac's boys, Jacob and Esau, the children of Isaac and Rebekah. Instead, at the time of his death, again, the great patriarch has only glimpsed only the smallest of beginnings of the fulfillment of the promises of God. You know, it's Job who gets the reputation for patience. Perhaps it should be Abraham. And perhaps it's a lesson in patience for us all. As the writer of the New Testament letter called Hebrews tells us, time after time, the people of God died not with a fulfillment of God's promises, but in the sure and certain hope that they would be fulfilled, which is the very definition of faith. Well, what about this field? What about this cave? Sarah is buried there. Abraham will be too. And in time, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah are also buried there. 3 generations of patriarchs and matriarchs. It is, we are told several times in the text, located in Hebron. And Hebron is also where, many centuries later, the seat of David's kingship began. Hebron was first where David was proclaimed king before David conquered Jerusalem, which lays about 30 kilometers to the northeast. Now, Hebron today, and the sanctuary known as the Cave of the Patriarchs, is surprisingly a Palestinian city, the largest in the West Bank, with a population of well over 200,000. It's in fact the largest Palestinian city outside of Gaza. Only around 700 Jewish settlers are encamped there on the outskirts of the ancient part of the city rather than in the city itself. And the city is divided between Palestinian legal control and authority, about 80%, with the remaining section, including the ancient part of the city, under Israeli military authority, largely to protect the very limited access to the Cave of the Patriarchs site and the interests of the smaller Jewish settler population. Now, sadly, tensions are often high, with eruptions of violence resulting in tragic deaths on both sides. Well, the Cave of the Patriarchs itself is regarded by Jews as the second most holy place in the world, second only to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem itself. Many Muslims regard Hebron as one of the 4 holy cities, along with Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Over the cave itself stands a very large rectangular enclosure, big building constructed during King Herod's reign. Many of Herod's foundation stones, building stones, are still there in place. In the 4th century, Byzantine Christians took it over and built a basilica church, which after the Muslim conquest in the 600s was converted into the Ibrahimi Mosque, the Mosque of Abraham. Now, Crusaders took over the site again in the 12th century, but then it was taken back by Salah ad-Din in 1188 and reconverted into a mosque, and it remained so until Israel took control of the site in 1967, dividing the structure into a synagogue and a mosque, which is how it remains divided to this day. And it's divided between Muslim and Jewish sections in the building itself by a thick pane of bulletproof glass. While the site can be visited by Christians, it rarely attracts Christian tours due to the difficulty and time involved in managing the many security checkpoints. And quite honestly, because of the sectarian violence that's there in the city, it can be a pretty depressing place to see. Which all in all is kind of a sad modern commentary on what should be a site of great veneration and peace, the resting place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and no less importantly, of Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. Who is Rebecca? Well, find out when we get together again for Genesis chapter 24, and we'll see you then.